Chapter 16. Mr. Stenmore descended from the taxi, paid the driver, and looked up at the front of the old Edwardian house with its gables and sash windows. He passed the stone entrance columns topped with moss-covered urns and walked up the drive. The copper sun of late autumn smudged through the pock-holed canopies that had turned gold and red. A gust of wind blew at the corner of his coat, sweeping leaves into his path where he crunched them underfoot. Gazing up at the outside of the house, he noticed the old paint and tarnished door-knocker, indicating an inhabitant that was not house-proud. Bramcote Avenue remained very much as it had the day the builders had left. 12 large, spacious mansions set in their own grounds and home to generations of principal academics who mentally laboured at the nearby Bramcote University for bioscience. As he looked up at the door, he hoped fellow and professor of molecular evolutionary systemics and epigenic inheritance in plants, Amelia Davenish Mercator, had received his letter. He'd sent it knowing she'd recognise his signature from the bottom of his grant letters. He'd invested heavily and wisely over the decades in frontline hypothetical ideas that dealt with algorithmic anomalies that occurred organically. These formed natural theoretical branches that ran from his core interest of patterns within numbers. He lifted the heavy door-knocker, allowing it to fall with a resounding boom that echoed back from inside. Before long, he heard a shuffle on the tile, nearing the door. The woman that opened it was not Miss Mercator. There was not enough depth behind the eyes. The woman before him belonged to those generously proportioned ladies whose ample bosom is barely constrained by a mandatory apron. He couldn't approve. No member of staff should ever open the front door wearing an apron. He understood Miss Mercator's lack of domestic interest. "Mr. Stenmore for Miss Mercator, I'm expected." His concern regarding her appearance, writ large on his face, made zero impact on Miss Mercator's housekeeper. "Come in," she encouraged enthusiastically. "I'm Merrily by name, merrily by nature." She chuckled at her well-worn pun. "Miss Mercator's out back in one of her greenhouses. You're expected. Come in, dearie." He noticed the smudge of flour on her cheek as she wiped her hands down the side of her apron and held them out for his hat and coat. He paused. Misinterpreting his hesitation, she laughed. "Don't worry, dearie, I've got my own. You'll get them back," she teased. Standing on tiptoes, she tugged his coat unceremoniously onto the horse stand and stood back, looking at him with a large grin at the accomplishment. "Go straight through, dearie, down the hall to your left and out of the French doors. The greenhouses are on the left." Merrily strode off, singing decidedly out of tune. He walked down the hallway with purpose and out into the garden towards the long Victorian greenhouses. Spying movement from within, he stepped over to the largest of them and stood hesitantly by the door, to be met by an abundance of the strangest and most colourful plants he'd ever seen, none of which existed in nature. Professor Amelia Mercator had been engrossed in examining a small, tender flowering plant when she heard the footsteps of her visitor. Now an octogenarian and eminent scientist, she exhibited none of the visual traits common to her age or profession. Her hair, coloured dark blue with a white streak on the left side, was stylishly cut short. She wore a white collared blouse tucked into bootleg jeans, finished with a leather belt and a simple horseshoe buckle. Her feet were clad in brown leather ankle boots, and hanging around her neck laid the strap from a gaily woven, large-brimmed sun hat which now rested on her back. Looking up, she smiled, the soft lines barely marring her face. She was still a handsome woman. Stepping forward whilst removing her gardening gloves, she greeted her guest and benefactor. "Mr. Stenmore, how very nice to finally meet you." "Good afternoon, Miss Mercator. I hope I'm not infringing upon your time." "No, not at all. I always potter between work. It helps to focus my thoughts and hopefully give me some inspiration." He felt at ease. She was a person to whom he could talk, factual, precise, and so far unemotional. His conversation with her would be the first step in a journey to learn if what he suspected and hoped for could actually be achieved, the changing of his genetic predispositions. He was buoyed at the prospect. "Let's go into the house. It's far more conducive to conversation. Will you take some refreshment?" "Yes, thank you. That would be most appreciated." He followed her into the house, where she laid her hat upon a French sideboard. Leaning into the kitchen, she asked merrily for tea and cake. Moving back down the hall, they entered a cool room with high ceilings, with partially faded and flocked wallpaper that had obviously not been redecorated for a considerable time. "This is a pleasant room," he offered by way of conversation. She looked around her as if seeing the room for the first time. "Yes, I suppose it is. I don't normally receive visitors," adding stiltedly, "You've come a long way, Mr. Stenmore. Your letter didn't provide a clear indication why you wanted to see me. I hope you found all of my work satisfactory?" "Yes, indeed. It's because of your work that I have a rather unusual question to ask that I felt would be better posed in person." She indicated a chair. Sitting down, he came straight to the point, asking, "I would be grateful if you were to outline your current findings in relation to plant genome identification and your work in developing new species." She looked at him with curiosity, not sure what the root of his question might be. "Certainly. As you know from my research, my field of study is on plant hybridity, why it occurs naturally in plants, but more importantly, how it can be influenced to change a plant's character and purpose. This will be a breakthrough in the governance of plant species and their application. For example, in crops, its effect could completely negate the need for pesticides. Of course, there are already a number of hybridized plants on the market, but my research is directed at evolving the future of mitochondria for purposes as yet undreamt of in this scientific field." "The power cells for all life," he affirmed. The door opened and merrily shuffled in under the weight of a tea tray laden with an enormous Victoria sponge cake oozing jam and cream. "Just pop them down there. We'll help ourselves. Thank you, Merrily." Merrily left with a satisfied smile. "Tea for you, Mr. Stenmore?" "Yes, thank you. No sugar." She poured and offered cake, which he politely declined. He asked the question that had been burning at the forefront of his mind since his musings at his club. "Can this science be applied to humans?" She'd just taken a sip of tea and almost choked. Swallowing quickly and carefully placing her cup and saucer back on the table, she looked at him with interest, a reaction he'd hoped for. The transference of method would be difficult, but not impossible. If I may be perfectly candid with you, my ultimate goal is to elevate this science to encompass human application, but I'm only in the rudimentary stages. Plants are not people." "Your research paper suggests you're on the threshold of human trials." She hesitated. The last thing she needed was for her funding to be withdrawn because of moralistic sensibilities. My research has always been focused on improving the quality and understanding of life. Your intentions are not in question, he assured. Let us say a person wished to change the fabric of their being. Let us say they had a predisposition to behave in a certain way, but they were hindered in their ability to exercise their free will to include such things as spontaneity, creative thought, or impulse, for example. We're a product of our genetics, refined and accumulated over millennia. And what if we're not? He countered. He took a sip of tea, knowing he'd dropped a bombshell, and waited for her response. Up until that point, their conversation had been relatively innocuous and could be subsequently mollified, leaving her none the wiser. Now, her aptitude to extrapolate and hypothesize would go into overdrive, and he was laid open. Her response confirmed his suspicion. Unexpected, but interesting. You are here, so it stands to reason on some level you're able to make decisions that are out of your normal sphere and to act upon them. You are changing your own patterns of behaviour naturally. She hesitated momentarily before asking, We are discussing permanent mental change as opposed to physical change. Yes, permanent mental change, he clarified. It's not possible to change an adult's DNA sequence at this time. However, the brain is a much more malleable entity when it comes to subatomic manipulation. The brain is a symbiotic organism to the body. Drugs and surgery are for the scientific primates. For example, to effect permanent change in mature plants without grafting requires the introduction of a transformed alkaloid with the required propensity and dominance. And in humans? It's all conjecture and theory. However, that's the birthplace of every science. What was impossible yesterday could be possible tomorrow. My life's work has been to create a cellular-based formula that works on a subatomic level that will grow human tissue that has been damaged or is missing, as in amputation. If a salamander can do it, so can we. I've isolated the gene responsible. She slowed. Your challenge intrigues me. It would have to be applied over a series of doses at an atomic level. Becoming increasingly absorbed by the possibilities, she continued, each application increasing in concentration until the desired effect is evidenced. I couldn't say definitively if the change would suit either permanently or be without catastrophic consequences. He observed her as the scientific wheels in her head gained momentum, before she continued, Based in a genetically sympathetic plasma solution, it could be administered using an air pipette directly into the eye. It would travel up through the optic nerve to the brain. She paused. Yes, I believe it could work. She paused again. You appreciate this is all hypothetical and has never been tried before. It's true, I've worked out certain RNA formula on paper, which I have then introduced to a hybridized Amaryllia genus, also a fungus, and it did exhibit a statistically significant increase in expression. Preempting his next question, she added, I was able to change its inherent nature. I would need to take a blood sample to work from. Using the EFM calculator, it will give me your RIP score. If the score is too high, I won't be able to help you. In explanation and not wanting to discourage such an opportunity, she added, I work from the nucleotides up. All of the statistics are superlatives in plant inheritance genetics. Plants can switch their genes on or off and switch them between organisms. It requires patience, not to replicate, but create. He leaned over with a smile. You know, I believe I will have a piece of cake. Realizing he'd just signed up for her hypothetical trial, she stated seriously, Mr. Stenmore, if you survive, you'd no longer be the man you are. The good as well as the bad will be different. Something may remain, but there are no guarantees. You understand? He swallowed, smiling. I'll have the necessary paperwork drawn up to protect you. You have done me a service by being honest with me, and by supporting my research all these years. It therefore behoves me to share an honesty with you, she stated pensively. Please continue. Naturally, my research has extended to humans and more. I believe our base genetics are just the tip of the iceberg. Our eye colour, gender, height, etc. What we've neglected to notice is the essence of what we're comprised of individually. These atomic structures are solely unique and separate. Everyone's accumulated generational experience adding their own on the top. In the more cerebrally aware, they're able to sense those experiences that left a more indelible mark on their ancestors. I've hypothesized using verifiable data that it's the same for everything on the planet. Unique existences, like one pebble to another or one person to another. This is not matter, but the hereditary exposure of all things that encapsulate what we are, which manifests not only in our predispositions, but in our primal selections, everything from a mate to our colour preference. These cannot be termed energies. They are historical memory gathered over eons and harnessed within ourselves. So why does a pebble choose to lie at the bottom of a river? Not because that's all it knows, but because that's how it's evolved. Sounds like a new science to me. Yes, I've called it starling. What you're asking me to do is to retrofit you, effectively to turn you off and turn you back on. And I find the idea completely absorbing. What will starling mean to us? She paused. When it's proven, its knowledge must not be for the mainstream. It would mean the end of civilization as we know it. Why? You're a prime example. Who could live knowing they're bound to an inherited life that's driven by their starling DNA? Becoming conscious of your unique history will negate and effectively wipe out a person's purpose. We've been designed not to have access to it, which raises its own questions. There's a reason our pleasure centres are more highly developed than any other living creature on the planet. It's a safeguard to keep us firmly locked into our life and time. For those whose pleasure centres have shrunk, I believe they will naturally evolve into a new branch of our species. You'll be my first starling experiment. Mr. Stenmore accepted the logic of it.